everyone, and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First letter. A new route, 6th of August 2014. My question after reading the article, AIDS Summit Delegates to Seek Asylum, 5th of the 8th, is, were these people genuinely attending the conference, or was it just a new way of entering Australia to apply for asylum? Jenny Salt, Rivervale. Okay, so what happened was there was a summit in Melbourne about AIDS, and a number of delegates came from around the world, and what happened was a number of the African delegates then applied for, about 25 of them applied for, or are planning on applying for asylum. Yeah. And so this raised questions, that maybe they'd come here dishonestly. So the first thing I've got to say in response to that is it's not new. Particularly during the Cold War, in the 80s, there were, and probably before, I don't remember, this was a fairly common thing for Russian people who came to the West, particularly to the US, say ballet dancers coming on tour as part of the Royal Moscow Ballet Company or whatever, to flee from their minders and seek asylum, and this was seen as a great and brave thing to do. These people were not seen as being dishonest in their attempts to flee from the Soviet Union. So this is not a particularly new thing. In fact, I suspect this has been happening for a lot longer, that people would use other methods to enter into countries in which they could then apply for asylum. It's only the demonising of asylum seekers here that has caused this to look like anything other than, a perfectly acceptable method of getting out of your own oppressive country. Now, the other side to this is also that most of these people did not come from particularly oppressive regimes. That is, most of the countries they came from did not have, controlling states or governments that were oppressive and preventing people from leaving. And so they weren't necessarily using the AIDS Summit as a pretense to leave their country. They may well have been free to leave. I suspect that countries like Uganda, where they have the death penalty for simply being a homosexual, may well be happy to allow gay people to leave their country, to get rid of them. What's actually happening here is that in a lot of these countries in Africa, to be an AIDS activist almost certainly means that you have some connection with homosexuality if you are not actually homosexual yourself. Homosexuality is massively taboo in a lot of Africa, and there is a huge amount of persecution of homosexuals. Now, places like Uganda have had the spotlight because of the laws that have been enacted against gay people. But most of the persecution in many of these countries comes simply from the society, not from the government. So a lot of these countries will have ostensibly not necessarily have any laws that are particularly well enforced against homosexual people, but they will have a massive societal problem with homosexuality, and say vigilante mobs will attack gay people, and the government will do absolutely nothing to keep those people safe. And that's the situation that a lot of these delegates find themselves in, that their work in Africa is supremely dangerous. They are arguing for the rights of people who have AIDS, say, essentially translates for most people, most members of the public seeing that would be, you are advocating for homosexual people, and that is an absolutely terrible thing. And you will get very limited, if any, protection from the government against vigilantes who want to harm you in some way. So, reading a little into this, about this, it's been suggested that one of the actually not unsurprising phenomena is that these people living in Africa don't realise how oppressed they are. They're sure that they do understand that they're in danger. But what happens is when they come to a conference in a country like Australia, it's only the getting out of their country and out of their continent, actually, because a lot of them, even if they've been to neighbouring countries, have a lot of the same sort of attitudes there, and are able to speak freely about AIDS and homosexuality and things like this, and have support from a general populace who realise actually how crazy the situation they are in their native country. And it's only then that they realise how oppressed and how in danger their life is, and how unreasonable that is, that they then think, why would I go back there? Why don't I deserve to live in peace and freedom? And it's at that point that they realise that, maybe it's worth applying for asylum. Now, the other side to this is, I really don't care, even if these people are deceitful, dishonest, and have no right to apply for asylum. If that's the case, then all of the processes here will basically get rid of them. They have no right to work here, so they are living, hand to mouth on the benefit of, from charities. They will have their claims assessed, and basically, if they're not found to have, genuine fear for their life, they will be deported straight back to the country they came from. I don't really see any problem in them, applying for asylum. I don't see a problem in anybody who happens to be here applying for asylum. They will be followed, the normal route will be taken, and if they don't meet the criteria, they'll be flushed back. So I don't quite understand why people are so upset about this, other than the fact that we've demonised asylum seekers to the point where anybody who claims asylum is automatically suspect. The Name of the Rose, 7th of August 2014. Many may agree with Stephanie Paternity's comments about the television show The Bachelor, and her view that women are now educated and independent. Game of Thorns, letters 6th of the 8th. They might also consider appreciating TV shows like this solely for entertainment value. Nobody is forcing the beautiful women to appear on the show, and it's only natural for the women to be subjected to the programme's demands. Mark Garretson Bunbury. So the backstory is we have a show here called The Bachelor. I'm pretty sure it's a US show that's being franchised around the world. Essentially, one man goes through a number of things with a bunch of women, and he slowly whittles them down by, I think he selects a certain number each episode, and the rest go home until he gets down to, the perfect woman. Obviously, this being television and reality TV at that, the entire focus is on these women, their looks, than their appearance rather than necessarily their intelligence or their personalities, to some extent. And usually it's played up, like all reality TV, for the conflict between the contestants, and in this case they're all women. So the angle that is generally pushed in this show and other shows like it is to try and portray these women as beautiful but vapid, vain and uninteresting, and to make as much hay as possible out of any kind of conflict they have, as being bitch fights and being very catty. That's the angle they want to play. Except for the supremely lovely girl next door types who are all down to earth and happen to be stunningly beautiful, which is the other sort of angle. Now, so people have taken issue with these shows, and I agree. But the main issue is not really about the contestants. Like all television, reality or otherwise, what you see on the television is unlikely to be a good representative of what actually happens on the set of the show and behind the scenes. So I have no idea what the contestants' experience of it actually is. They are highly sexualized, and they are, completely objectified on the television show, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's happening on camera, like behind the scenes, and their participation in it. They may well actually have a completely enjoyable experience of being on it, in the same way that, say, Survivor managed to generally demonize a particular person and make them out to be a terrible person for the sake of the entertainment value, that doesn't necessarily reflect what's happening behind the scenes. I think the same is probably happening here. So I actually don't really care all that much about the contestants. Same way I don't necessarily care too much about the particular contestants in, say, Miss Universe pageant. The real problem is about the viewer. So what this show is doing is it's perpetuating this stereotype that the value of women comes entirely from their sexualization and their objectification. It's how beautiful you look. Because behind the scenes your personality must be terrible, or if it's not, you must be you have to strive to be this paragon of sort of homely, down-to-earth loveliness in a beautifully prepackaged shell. The fact that this excludes almost all women from actually meeting this criteria is not helpful. Now, on the other hand, the guy in this is a former male topless model, I think, and, probably a personal trainer or something like that, who is flawlessly, good-looking, and is portrayed as being basically probably somewhere in the lines of as dumb as a box of hammers. The portrayals of men in this are not nothing to be proud of either. But most of the focus of the show is on the female contestants. There's about 12 of them to start with, I think, to the one guy. So the 12 contestants, the women, get the most of attention. And so a lot of what the show does is promote this one view about what it means to be successful as a woman. That is that you need to compete for the heart of one person against all those other women. And that is frankly damaging to society. This is not the view that we want, that I or many other people want promoted in society. And that's the problem we have with it. Not particularly about whether, there are other roles for women. It's that this is the traditional role. Everybody's well aware that this is one possibility about what that you can choose for yourself. It's not like it needs much pushing. On the other hand, there's a lot of better role modelling that could be done on TV, and every time a show like this is made, there's another show where women are portrayed as being smart, intelligent, valuable for who they are rather than what they look like, that isn't being made. And so that's the real issue I have with this show, is the message it's sending to the viewers. And yes, like I suspect everybody could agree that this may well be a perfectly entertaining TV show. You may well enjoy it. But just because something's enjoyable doesn't mean it's not sending a negative message. This is one of the points that's made about video games in particular, that you can simultaneously enjoy playing a video game and also recognise that it has some particularly terrible messages that it's sending. These two things are not mutually exclusive. And I wouldn't say that entertainment value is necessarily a redeeming feature. Just because it is entertaining doesn't necessarily mean that it should still be on the air. Unless you're somehow arguing that the only way that television can be entertaining is somehow to have, regressive and dated stereotypes of its participants, which I don't think is true. A lot of the TV that is entertaining to a lot of people doesn't have these regressive stereotypes. And lastly, you are right in a sense when you say that nobody is forcing these people to go on that television show. You are right that nobody's holding a gun to their head and not coerced into doing it. But the more that this is presented as the only option for a woman, the more we are, as a society, coercing them into fitting into that stereotype. There is a whole spectrum between having a gun held to your head and being able to freely choose with no external, constraints or no external pressures. And I don't think this is ever possible in our society. There's always a sort of a culture that we are marinated in that seeps into in every sort of aspect of our personality and belief system, which is always going to control us to some degree. Now, it's not the same as thou shalt conform, like you shall have the same haircut as Kim Jong-un. That is a level of coercion that we don't have in our society. But if every single TV show is like this, yes, we are pushing women into these kind of roles. Yes, we are not forcing them necessarily, but we are pushing them into it in a way that I don't think is helpful. Equally unacceptable. 7th of August 2014. Foreign Minister Julie Bishop is right when she says that the shelling of UN schools in Gaza by Israelis is unacceptable. Shelling of UN schools indefensible, says Bishop, 6th of the 8th. But she should also have said that the locating of rocket launchers by Hamas near places where helpless civilians can be found is equally unacceptable. John Melville Jones, Yanchep. So I'm actually quite proud that our foreign minister, essentially our sort of main representative on foreign affairs, was willing to condemn some of Israel's actions. This is something that not a lot of Western governments have been doing. And I would be surprised if she hadn't also condemned Hamas. It may not have been reported particularly in this newspaper, or maybe in that one article. I would be very surprised if our government was supportive of Hamas. Our government is, the Australian governments of all political persuasions have always been very supportive of Israel, and with good reason. There is a widespread view in the Middle East by many of the populace and many of the rulers that Israel should not exist and that Jews should be exterminated. Not just evicted from Israel, but actually literally exterminated. And so most Western governments have seen it as being a reasonable thing to support Israel's existence. That said, Israel does not use proportionate force in responding to the threat posed by particular militant groups. So when Hamas fires a few rockets, or many rockets at Israel, the amount of damage done is really quite small. We look at handfuls of people killed, if any. Most of the rockets have very little effect other than to scare people. So there's an emotional, visceral response, but there is not necessarily a huge material amount of damage done compared to the Israeli response. The Israeli response is often to kill hundreds of people in Palestine. Now, the West, we get hung up on distinguishing those members of Hamas who are actively fighting against Israel, i.e. who have the guns and the bombs and the rockets, versus those other members of the Palestinian people. And so when we look at the people that Israel kills, a lot of them are civilians and children who can't possibly be Hamas fighters, and who aren't. So we get hung up on this idea that Hamas is hiding its weapons amongst its civilian population, which is partially true. But also, there's not a lot of room in Gaza. There's not a lot of open fields where Hamas can stage pitched battles with Israel. That's not the nature of warfare anymore, anywhere, but certainly not within Gaza. Secondly, just because somebody happens to be using a human shield doesn't mean that you're automatically justified in just killing that human shield, which is what Israel is essentially doing, saying that we don't care that you have civilians around your guns, we're just going to bomb them anyway. In fact, Israel has a policy of when there is a Hamas militant who has been killed or identified or whatever, they have a policy of bulldozing the homes of their family as a sort of retaliation for, you supported this person, or at least you're a member of their family, so therefore we assume that you supported them, so we're just going to bulldoze your home because we don't like that. So Israel seems to take this policy of that they really do think that they can bomb Gaza into submission, and Gaza has shown that you can't. You can't bomb us into submission. And part of the reason for that is because the civilian population genuinely hate Israel, or Jews. There's a sort of an equivocation there, but actually in a lot of Middle East they're seen as one and the same, more or less. And so there is a widespread view amongst people in Palestine that the Jews are awful, horrible people who deserve to die. And so it's not a clear cut between the sort of the Hamas people who are the evil, murderous warmongers, and a civilian population who, want to live in peace. There is a civilian population that generally that is brainwashed. I mean, there are children's TV shows in the Middle East that Hamas actually makes its own children's TV shows that are for brainwashing children into their view of Jewish people as being evil, and suicide bombing and terrorist acts as being perfectly fine. And so the civilian population is largely brainwashed into thinking that Hamas are doing the right thing by attacking. The Israeli response is completely, out of whack with the kind of impact that the militants are having. But at the same time, they are absolutely hated by much of the civilian population anyway. So it's not as clear-cut as any of that anyway. But back to the letter, I would be incredibly surprised if you found, our foreign minister not criticising Hamas. Criticising Hamas is an easy thing to do because they have no rational, they have no reason for supporting them. They are completely unsupportable. A Mother's Place, 8th of August 2014. What do I think of the childcare crisis? Pretty easy answer. Where should the mother be? At home, looking after the children themselves. Margaret Neclaire Willerton. Okay, so I've got a dog in this fight. I'm personally invested in the idea about where mothers should be. My wife works full-time. I stay at home with our son full-time and don't work. Is this an ideal situation for our family? Absolutely. For the idea that because you are biologically capable of producing children, you are therefore psychologically tuned to being at home full-time with your child is complete rubbish. To argue, if you want to argue that, say, if you're not sort of made to stay at home with a child, then perhaps you shouldn't have children, then I would probably broadly agree with you, except that our society, and many others, has a default view that all women should have children, full stop, and that if you are a woman of childbearing age, particularly if you've been married for a while and you don't happen to have children, this is seen as being quite an anomaly that needs explaining. Most people see it as an absolute tragedy if a woman is incapable of having children. This is part of the assumption that having children is exactly what they should be doing, that all mothers should be having children. And so I would only agree with you, the idea that people, I agree with you that people shouldn't have children if they're not set up for it. But I think we've got a way to go as a society that makes that an acceptable and okay thing for particularly women, but also men, to simply choose not to have children because they're not that way inclined. And I don't think there's any real good research. In fact, from what I've looked, there is no good research that shows that fathers say, or even there is a gender imbalance towards, who makes a better stay-at-home parent. I think there is some evidence that you need to have good, competent caregivers for children, but they don't necessarily even need to be the mother and father. Any sort of well-invested grandparent, auntie, uncle, adoptive, whatever is fine. We're pretty sure that children who receive out-of-home care do just as well, as long as that out-of-home care is as well, is of high quality. So the fact that you think that women should stay home is out of step with reality. There's no evidence there that that is exactly what should happen. And actually, the evidence shows that happy parents make good parents. The children of happy parents are inevitably better. Not inevitably, but end up better off. And so for a lot of mothers who are not necessarily cut out to be stay-at-home with the kids, their children will do better with them going back to work because they will be happier going back to work, and therefore at the times that they have with the child, they will be better parents. Last one for today. The Case for Commerce, 8th of August 2014. With all the hundreds of good empty commercial buildings for lease in the city and suburbs, why the hell are brand new commercial buildings still popping up nearby and in new areas not even built yet? Brad Capes Kubler. Now, I'm not sure that this is actually true, but I will take it as read for the purposes of this letter, that there is some level of vacancy in commercial buildings, and yet we're building more commercial premises. And I would suggest that this is probably just the way that capitalism works, that generally speaking, there is profit to be made in renting out commercial premises, right? And what that means is that if you're making a profit over every single, so if we consider a commercial premises that has a number of units within it that can be leased, and if you're making a profit over renting out each of those units, which you should be, and that's the default assumption here, that it's quite likely that you don't need to have full occupancy in order to make a profit, in order to break even. And in a highly competitive marketplace, say, or in a sort of efficient market, as it were, you only ever need to really break even, or at least you only need to compete with other investment opportunities. So if we have 100 commercial units and the profit off each one is, say, 10%, then that means the break-even point is to be able to rent out, say, 90% of them. That means that at 90% you are breaking even, and at that point you may well consider opening more commercial units. Obviously, the more you can rent out, the better. But there's always going to be competition from other people who are going to look at your thing, see your occupancy rate, think I can open up another one over here, and I only need to achieve 90% occupancy rate in order to break even. Anything above that is profit. Beautiful. There are other factors about location and stuff, but essentially that means that it's quite reasonable. The fact that we can make a profit off renting commercial units means that it's still going to make sense to build more even when there are vacant units. So it seems a little bit counterintuitive that you would build more when there's vacancies, but actually it works out perfectly fine and is based on the fact that you just simply make a profit. Only in markets where you don't make any profit would it make no sense to build any more. That is, only in markets where you are only able to rent at them at cost would it make sense to only build more when you had full occupancy. So there you go. There's a little seeming paradox in the capitalist system. That's it for this week. Unfortunately, there were no good letters about some of the major issues that we had here in WA that I want to rant about. Things like surrogacy and triumph of the human spirit in rescuing a commuter. Maybe we'll have that next week. But I feel better for having had a rant. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See ya.